Hi, everyone. In this week's Torah portion, Parshat Tol'dot, we're introduced to Jacob and Esau, twins born of Rebekah and fathered by Isaac. And in the traditional reading of this story, Jacob is elevated and Esau is marginalized and dehumanized. In fact, in rabbinic tradition, Esau is so dehumanized because he's seen as the progenitor and the embodiment of the Roman Empire, and so he is murderous and degenerate. And that may have been a perfectly reasonable interpretive strategy in the 3rd century when the rabbis lived under Roman domination. But with its dehumanization, I see it as a disastrous strategy for the 21st century. And so as I look to the story, I look to clues that undo the demonization and the othering of Esau, and I look to the very sympathetic portrayal that the Torah gives of Esau's early years. And this year, I'm particularly inspired by an interpretation given this story by Diane, Sharon, who is a biblical scholar, and I found this interpretation in the Women's Torah Commentary published by the Union of Reformed Judaism. And what Diane Sharon suggests is that Rebekah misinterpreted the divine oracle that came to her that served as the pretext for elevating Jacob and demonizing Esau. Now, to turn back to the story, we are reintroduced in this week's Torah portion to Rebekah and Isaac, Rivka, and Yitzchak 20 years into their marriage, and they have yet to produce an heir. And so Isaac turns to God, and Rebekah becomes pregnant. And soon after she becomes pregnant, the twins are struggling in her womb. And so she turns to God out of desperation, and God provides her an oracle. And the oracle is that there are 2 nations in her womb, and the greater will serve the lesser. Rav Ya'avod et Hatza'ir in Hebrew. And there's a real question, I think, as to who is the greater, who is the lesser. The translation is often the older will serve the younger, but that already seems to determine it, because when the twins emerge from the womb, we see that already there is a play and an irony about these 2 brothers. That Esau, once they grow up, becomes represents brawn, and he is the hunter, and Jacob is Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim, he is mild and he dwells in tents, and yet he is going to be the heir. And so who is greater and who is lesser, who's more powerful than whom? These are terms that are inherently ambiguous in the biblical formulation. And so Diane Sharon says that what Rebekah does is overdetermine who is to do what. And she further supports her argument by saying that if Rebekah overdetermines the ambiguity of this divine oracle and misrepresents it, we would expect dire consequences to ensue. And in fact, you see those dire consequences almost immediately. And so Jacob steals his brother's blessing, which causes Esau to fly into a murderous rage, and Jacob has to flee, and Rebekah and Jacob never see each other again. The blessings upon Jacob do come into fruition, but only after decades of hard labor and humiliation at the hands of his father-in-law Lavan. And finally, Jacob himself suffers. His beloved wife Rachel will die in childbirth. And so we see that despite all the blessings and the ways in which the prophecy kind of becomes true for Jacob, that they happen at a great cost, which may point to Rebekah misrepresenting and misinterpreting the divine oracle and placing Jacob in one light and Esau in another. And so what does this mean? Well, I actually think that we see echoes of the consequences of this othering throughout the tradition and raises questions that ultimately reflect back upon us. So I've already mentioned the great costs to Rebekah and Isaac and the family over this othering, but of course, as we perpetuate this othering in the tradition, this impulse to demonize and to marginalize, we have to ask the question, well, what does that do to us? What does that do collectively, and what does that do to our tradition? And then there's another point that comes up with this, which is that Rebekah in the Torah portion, she has this gift of divine revelation, and it's expressed in a couple of other ways, albeit sotto voce throughout the Parsha. And yet, despite this gift and despite this power, it doesn't protect her or her family, for that matter, from the consequences of this marginalization and this othering of Esau. And the final thing I'll say about this is that we see Rebekah's power in this Torah portion. There's a modern move to sort of portray her as manipulative and deceptive, but there's a feminist interpretation of Rebecca that I find very convincing that suggests that Rebecca's power here is an echo of a hidden narrative in the Torah of women's independent power and autonomy and authority, which ultimately becomes suppressed by the patriarchal narrative that emphasizes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Joseph in the Torah. And so one of the questions is, if we delve into this hidden story, do we perhaps have the opportunity to undo the othering of Esau as well? And so what happens when we do that? Well, the thing about this is that the biblical revolution in thought actually goes against the whole idea of othering Esau in the first place, because the biblical revolution in thought is that there is one God who is ultimately transparent in the power of creation and the power to deliver love and to deliver justice. And so to the division that, to the extent that we have these divisions and these hierarchies and these systems of oppression in our midst, they come not from God or even from the vision of the Bible, but they come from the ways in which we distort that essential meaning. And we distort that essential meaning to our own fears, our own prejudices, our own preferences. But we can undo these distortions by going back into the stories we know, the stories we don't know, and the stories we only have glimpses or faint clues about, to undo and then to redo the tikkun, the restoration of what would otherwise have been. And for communities, this can be a painful thing. It can be a painful thing to look back at the foundations of how we see ourselves. But I believe that it's only by going into these foundations of how we see ourselves and uncovering the imperfections and uncovering the problematic impulses that we have there, it's only by doing that that we can unleash what's possible and what we can become. So thank you for tuning in. Wish you a Shabbat Shalom. May we all be agents of ongoing tikkun, healing, and justice in the world. Thanks, everybody.